Hi, everyone. It's 12 noon here, so we'll get started with today's webinar. First off, I just want to thank everybody for joining us today. Our presenter will be Dan Manz. Dan?
Yes, good morning. How's everybody? Thank you all very much for getting on today. I particularly want to thank the folks at NREMT, Matt Whiting and Joanne Friel for putting this together. NREMT is a really important national partner in a lot of different EMS activities, and so the opportunity to share a little bit about REPLICA, kind of what's going on with this national EMS compact with you guys is an important part of the dialogue and communication. For those of you that I don't know, just a little bit about me. I'm retired after 25 years as the EMS Director in Vermont. I was with the Vermont Department of Health during that time. I retired there about 6 years ago, went to work managing a local ambulance service in the community I live in. Did that for 5 years and then really retired. My wife says, okay, I've now failed retirement because I keep coming back doing little project work for the National Association of State EMS Officials. And that was kind of how I end up here today. A few years ago, I was the moderator, facilitator for the group that actually wrote this REPLICA compact. And I hosted those meetings, kept everybody in the room until they were tired of each other and actually got words on a paper. And that was kind of how REPLICA was born. Very nice person, colleague over in New Hampshire, Sue Prentice, became a national advocate, was helping to move this thing along. And she recently took a job with the American Trauma Society. And so the folks at NREMT came and said, gee, Dan, you sort of knew how this thing came about. Would you be willing to come back and be the national advocate? So that's what brings me here today. I've got some slides with prepared remarks to go through. We'll try and go over a little bit about how REPLICA works, how compacts work in general, because it's a concept that's not familiar or necessarily intuitive to a lot of folks. We'll talk about what it takes to get REPLICA going in a state, and then we'll have some time at the end, and I'll be happy to take any questions that you may have about how this whole thing works. So the first question is, why REPLICA? And I think REPLICA is sort of a natural evolution in emergency medical services systems as personnel move across state lines in daily responses. All of this cross-border stuff, when I was the EMS Director in Vermont, it was kind of a dirty little secret that we just sort of kept our head down and didn't pay a lot of attention to. Ambulances in Vermont would transport patients into other states would transport patients into Vermont. You know, I had a clear line in the sand. If a out-of-state ambulance service was picking up a patient in Vermont, transporting them to a hospital in Vermont, the agency needed a license, and that triggered the personnel then needing a license. But we just didn't pay a lot of attention to this. Interestingly, the group that sort of brought the need for this to everybody's attention were the nice guys in Homeland Security. And it turns out that Homeland Security personnel, EMS qualified, licensed in some state, are often moving between states on various assignments that they may have to serve warrants or transport people in custody, do a variety of activities. And so Homeland Security started approaching the state saying, gee, how is it that our people are able to function, or are they able to function legally when they move between states? And everybody's answer was kind of blah, 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 blah. Nobody had a really good answer on exactly how that should work. And Homeland Security was pointing out kind of the obvious, that it's not really feasible for their personnel to hold licenses in all 50 states. You know, that just as a practical matter is kind of difficult to do. So it got people thinking and talking about how would we support the mobility of qualified EMS personnel between the states. How do we protect the public, which in the end is sort of the function of licensure to begin with, and how could we share data about who's moving where and when. So the concept of REPLICA was born, and it allows EMS personnel to do their job, allows them to move across states, protects the public through a proper screening process, you know, assures that there is a uniform standard on national fitness to practice. Part of REPLICA, part of this compact, is that states have common standards in terms of personnel certification, criminal background screening, age, so forth and so on, so that each state knows that a candidate or a person moving into their state from another REPLICA state meets a common set of standards that is all part of protecting the public. One of the tempting questions in this whole thing is, why didn't the feds just make a federal solution for this? Why don't the feds just set a standard and say, hey, this applies to all states? The answer to that is the feds really aren't very good at that. To do a federal solution is very, very difficult. It would mean the feds would have to pass some kind of federal law. States generally object to that because licensure and protection of personnel from licensed professions is generally a matter that falls to state licensing rather than meeting some federal standard. So for a variety of reasons, it seemed a better solution to do this a different way through this mechanism of a compact. So a little history about compacts, because I think they're not, as I said earlier, something that is generally well known to people, even folks who are involved in licensing of professions. So compacts are allowed for, as it turns out, in the U.S. Constitution. Article 1, Section 10, Clause 3 provides a constitutionally granted right for states to enter into multi-state agreements for their common benefit. The Supreme Court affirmed the authority of states to enter into compacts to delegate authority to an interstate agency, which is what happens when states pass a compact law. That was the case of West Virginia versus Sims back in 1951. Compacts are not run by any one state or a regional or federal agency. Rather, when a compact is born, it stands up a joint public agency to manage the operations through a compact commission. Each state that's a member of a compact has a seat on that commission. The commission writes rules that address policy issues for how the compact operations will occur. These compact commissions are public organizations. They generally have the same kind of requirements for notice and open public meetings as states do when they write their own rules. But these are self-governing entities for the purposes specified only in the compact, and states, it allows for states to retain and maintain their own sovereignty. The probably the best known compact that I think people can get around is a driver's licensing compact that you all have a license to drive in a particular state, your home state where you live, but you're able to cross state borders legally, drive in other states. Notice a few things about that. There's rules about that if you were to move to another state, you have a certain period of time, usually I think it's 6 months, that you can continue to drive on your original home state license before you have to get a license in the new state that you have moved to. Notice when you're driving in a state that is not your home state, you're still required to follow the rules of the road, the laws of the road in that particular state. So it doesn't do me any good if I get stopped for speeding in New York State and they say, hey, you were going 70 miles an hour on an interstate that here is posted for 55. I can't say, well, gee, I'm from Vermont and our interstate speed limits are 70 miles an hour, so I should be able to get to drive 70 here. Now, you still have to follow the rules of the road wherever it is that you're driving. So that's one example of a compact that all states are involved in. Other compacts that some of you may be familiar with are the Emergency Management Assistance Compact when there's large, major declared disasters. There's also a Nurse Licensure Compact that many states belong to that has certain provisions for reciprocity of nurses. More recently, there is a Physician Licensure Portability Compact that allows for cross-border practice of physicians as well. Compacts cover all different kinds of things. Some folks from the southwestern part of the country may be familiar with compacts that govern water usage in rivers that are the border between two states. So those river compacts, those water use compacts, are examples of compacts where maybe only 2, 3, 4 states are involved, but they work very similar to the larger national compacts as well. There's over 200 interstate compacts alive and working in the United States today. Here's a quick map that shows, and I think this maybe is a year or two old, so it may have changed a little bit, but it shows the number of compacts that each state in the nation is involved in. I think the leading state in compacts, as I understand it, maybe has 38 compacts that they're involved in. So states have used compacts for a variety of things. It's interesting as states have contemplated entering this EMS REPLICA compact. One of the first questions that legislators ask is, gee, what is this compact thing? Oh, it looks like our state's giving up, rights to this commission. How does this work? One of the quick answers is, well, let us tell you how many compacts your state is already a member of, and they all kind of work similarly. And that usually sends the legislators back to doing a little research in their own laws and statutes. So here's what happened from 2012 when we started working on this compact to today. First off, there was a needs assessment done. We considered would a compact fit as a solution to this cross-border problem of EMS personnel having to work in multiple states. We pulled together a national advisory panel It was made up of a number of national EMS organizations to think through how a compact for EMS might work conceptually. That moved on to a smaller drafting team that actually had to take pencil to paper and write the doggone thing. Then we've been going through, and we're sort of still in phase 3, education and enactment. We currently have 16 states involved in the compact and a number of others who will likely be considering it during this upcoming legislative session. And then phase 4 is compact administration. The way this REPLICA compact worked, it took 10 states to pass compact legislation for the compact to become active. When we reached the 10th state, the compact was actually formed, the commission became active, and the commission started working on rulemaking and some of the other activities related to commission administration. More states have joined, and that's sort of where we're at. We're sort of in phase 3 and phase 4 simultaneously today. Who was on the National Advisory Panel? Here's the list. It includes National Association of EMS Educators. It includes some other folks who are involved in compact administration. It included some of the federal agencies as well as a number of the other professional organizations. I think there were some groups who had sort of interests in getting a compact up and active. For instance, the Association of Air Medical Services, helicopters cross state lines routinely every day. It is not an unusual event for air medical service to start in state A, fly to pick up a patient in state B, transport that patient to state C, and then go back to their home base in state A. I recall hearing from flight personnel saying they were trying to meet the requirements and juggle licenses in 9 different states at the same time. And it was really tedious and just very, very difficult to make that work. So I think there was a lot of examples about how a compact would benefit the EMS profession. So 23 different organizations. We got together for a couple of 2-day meetings, and these folks reached consensus on kind of high-level guidance on what would be necessary for a compact to work. That led to a few decisions. The National Advisory Panel said, yep, let's go forward with a compact. Largely, I think the compact model was decided upon so that they could preserve state sovereignty and collective control. They wanted a system of self-regulation by the states where a common national policy could be put into place. Data could be exchanged between states, but it needed to remain flexible enough so that it could change and adapt as the EMS profession and industry continues to grow and change. We work closely with the Council of State Governments National Center for Interstate Compacts. Council of State Governments is a group that is a resource to all state legislatures and governors in the states. These folks have an office within the Council of State Governments devoted to development and implementation of interstate compacts. They are really sort of the technical experts on how compacts work, how compact law works, what needs to be in a compact for it to be effective. The National Advisory Panel then was reduced into a compact drafting team. We had 5 folks from the CEMSO, a representative from the Council of State Governments, and then you can see the other groups. We also had an attorney from Vetter Price. Vetter Price is the law firm that has represented the National Registry for a number of years. The National Registry was very interested in this project because they are the national certification agency and are frequently asked questions about practice and qualifications of practice, interstate issues of practice. And their attorney, as it turned out, had also been legal counsel to the nurses organization when the nurses established their interstate compact. So this drafting team got together 4 times for 2-day meetings over 7 months, lots of communications back and forth, and actually wrote the REPLICA Compact. So REPLICA is the recognition of EMS personnel licensure interstate compact. That's the acronym. God, is that thing tedious? I can never remember exactly what REPLICA is without looking at a slide on it. But anyway, that's how it got its name. The REPLICA Interstate Compact has sort of some key elements to it. So one is it is model legislation. For a compact to be enacted, a state legislature has to pass language that is standard compact language that is common to all the states. So this is kind of a difficult matter for state legislatures who like to tinker with things all the time, to get them to pass the same language in state A, a state B, a state C. Legislatures can tweak the language a little bit as long as it is done in sort of non-substantive ways. So the pillars of this compact are that the compact is a contract. It's an agreement that states legally enter into to solve a joint common issue or problem that is caused by a border. The statute does, as I say, have to be adopted in whole, and all states that enter the compact are bound by this agreement. There's various ways to structure a compact. In this particular case, the compact does not create a multi-state license for personnel to practice, but rather it is a recognition by all participating states of a license that was issued by another participating state, and all of the states provide a privilege to practice for the personnel holding a license in another replica state. So it's a legal pathway for providers to come into your state and to be held accountable. At the same time, for providers from your state to go out into another compact state and be able to function and provide emergency medical services. The database enables all participating states to share their licensing information, see the disciplinary histories on personnel who are licensed by any of the participating replica states. And then there's the Compact Commission, which is stood up to create rules, handle the details, manage the administration of the replica compact. Another element of this was that all of the participating states agreed to give priority to military veterans and their spouses for expedited processing. Replica was a way to enhance military personnel, veterans who were entering civilian EMS practice to do this expedited licensing to get them in. And it's garnered us great support in getting Replica passed by the various branches of the military. I mentioned also this national coordinated database. As the compact is being stood up, the decision has been made for the National Registry to manage the coordinated licensure database. So participating states will be sharing their EMS licensure database back to the registry. The registry will hold that in a consolidated single database, and that will be where the states are able to go and see the licensure history and activity of personnel from all of the other participating states. So to enter the compact, states have to be eligible. There are requirements that not every state meets. So the first one is that they have to utilize the National Registry exam at the EMT and paramedic levels, at least for initial licensure. Personnel do not have to maintain national registration on into perpetuity, but the state has to use the National Registry exam for at least EMTs and paramedics. States have to also have an FBI compliant background check with biometric data. Currently, that's fingerprints. They don't have to have that today to enter the compact, but they have to have it within 5 years of compact activation. So I think that puts us out around 2022. States will have to implement use of the FBI compliant background check. Does that mean that every person in the state will have had an FBI compliant background check? Not necessarily, but it means going forward as states add new people into their system, that all of those folks will have to have an FBI compliant background check. And states have to have a process to receive, investigate, and resolve complaints about provider activities, and they have to share that information on their investigation and disciplinary activities with the coordinated database. And then finally, each state has to pass the model replica legislation. So for some states, that's a big lift, depending on where they are today with these various issues. Other states, it was a pretty easy lift because they were already using the National Registry. They already had the FBI compliant background check. They had organized processes for investigations and data management on that. And so the only thing was passing the model replica legislation. Okay, what's required for an individual to receive this privilege to practice in another state? They have to be licensed in their home state as an EMT, advanced EMT, or the term advanced EMT still, I think, has a number of connotations depending on which state you're in. So the compact legislation defines it as some level between EMT and paramedic. They have to be practicing in good standing in their home state, meaning they can't have any restrictions or qualifications on their license. They have to be working in their home state under the supervision of an EMS medical director, a licensed physician medical director, and the person has to be at least 18 years of age. Those would be the requirements for a person to be able to receive the privilege to practice under replica when they cross a border and are working in another state. So what does replica not do? I think these are some things that are sort of subtle details, but often misunderstood. So replica is not a multi-state license. And that's an important concept because a license gets issued by only one state, and only that state is able to take the license away or put conditions on a license if there were to be a practice problem with that provider. So this is truly a privilege to practice based on a clean, unrestricted, unconditioned license in a home state. It also does not create automatic reciprocity. So for instance, if I live in a replica state and I were to move, I take a new job and I move to another replica state, I don't get to just show up in the new state that I'm moving to and say, hey, I came from this other replica state. Give me a license because, you see, I met the replica requirements for the privilege to practice. Interestingly, I think states that are entering the REPLICA Compact are actually starting to think about this a little bit. I was speaking with the State EMS Director in Texas the other day, who is the head of the commission, the REPLICA Commission. And he was saying they were considering rule language in Texas that would enable somebody to move into Texas from another replica state, grant them the ability to start work tomorrow for an agency in Texas, and enable them to have 90 days to work under their home state license while they were in the process of applying for and receiving a license from Texas. Kind of an interesting idea. That's sort of what happens with driver's licenses. If you think about it, you still have to apply. You may have to go down to the Department of Motor Vehicles, pass an eye test. I don't know if there's any states where you have to do a driving test, but you have to go through the requirements to get licensed in whatever state you move to, but you have some period of time during which you could operate on your original home state driver's license. So it may be that replica is a way to facilitate reciprocity, but it does not create automatic reciprocity. Interestingly, replica is limited only to EMS personnel, has no effect, no authority over EMS agency ambulance service licensure. So if states have rules about when an organization has to become licensed to operate in their state, then those laws and rules are still in effect. Replica has no impact on them. There is no authority in replica over agency licensure. And replica does not reach into state EMS operations in unrelated jurisdictions. So if a person comes into a replica state from a non-replica state, they would not have the privilege to practice, nor would a person going from a replica state into a non-replica state, they would have no expectation of any ability to practice in that non-replica state. Subtle details, and some of these things are yet to be sort of fleshed out and described exactly in rules that are currently being developed for replica. Here is the map of who is in today. And so you can kind of look at this map and say, wow, gee, some of these states look like they're in pretty good shape. Like, let's look at Kansas. I think if we could figure out how to get Oklahoma into replica, notice Kansas is fully surrounded by other replica states, which will make cross-border activities for them pretty seamless all the way around. So some states have entered replica and are sort of standalone, like Texas is right now. Other states have entered replica. Alabama is a good example. surrounded by several other replica states, which should make cross-border activities pretty easy for them. The more states we can bring into replica, obviously, the better this thing works for everybody across the country. Okay, what do we do about discipline and adverse actions? So the home state has the exclusive ability to take disciplinary action against a license issued by that state in accordance with their own state laws and regulations. I said earlier, the home state who gave the license is the only one that can act upon that license. If a home state were to condition or remove a license, the privilege to practice in every other state is immediately lost. So it's kind of interesting how this replica thing works. Even though if I live in a replica state, I hold a license in a replica state, that license becomes somewhat more high stakes, because if I have an issue in my home state, I can lose the privilege to practice in all other replica states. Likewise, a remote state could take an action on an individual's privilege to practice within that state. So I hold a license in state A, I go into state B. There's a complaint about my care, there's an investigation, it's determined that I did something wrong or inappropriate in that state. I can lose the privilege to practice in state B. Once I lose the privilege to practice in state B, under the terms of replica, I also lose the privilege to practice in all other participating states. And my home state may investigate and may take licensure action based on whatever it was I did inappropriately in the remote state. You think about that, go back to the driver's license analogy for a minute. If I hold my driver's license in Vermont, but I come to California and I do something egregious in California, I, cause a serious crash, leave the scene of an accident, injure a number of people, California can't really take my license away, but in the driver's license compact, Vermont agrees based on findings that could happen in California. Vermont may very well take action and remove my driver's license in the state of Vermont. So similar sort of parallel to how that would work under replica. So here's kind of a complicated model of how this could work, that if my license is acted upon, it's suspended or revoked in my home state. This is an example of somebody who holds a license in two states, in Texas and Louisiana. Texas is a replica state, Louisiana not a replica state. But if Texas were to take my license away, suspend it, revoke it, something like that, I lose the privilege to practice in all of those other states that are participants in replica. Similarly, if I were to have my privilege to practice suspended in another participating replica state, in this case Virginia, Virginia would suspend my privilege to practice. That would go into the coordinated database. All of the other states would be notified of the loss of the privilege to practice in Virginia, and it would be automatically suspended in all of the other replica states. And it now becomes a Texas question to decide whether or not to take my license away. Sort of a complicated diagram, but there's how the disciplinary history in this thing works as well. Some states have alternative programs. So if, for instance, I had maybe a DWI, or operating under the influence of drugs or alcohol, in a home state, and it was determined that I had a substance abuse problem, the state may provide an opportunity for me to participate in some alternative program, and under a set of conditions, that information would remain non-public, and I could continue practice as long as I continued to meet certain requirements that were set by my home state. In those cases, the state might not be able to share that information into the REPLICA database, but part of entering the alternative program would be that I would need to agree not to practice in any other member state during the term of my alternative program without prior authorization from the other member state. So for instance, Dan lives in Vermont, and I work in a setting where I have to cross the border occasionally into New Hampshire. And so if I entered an alternative program in Vermont, I would need to agree I won't practice in any other REPLICA state. If I said, but yeah, like I work in this place where I have to be able to go over the border to New Hampshire, it would require me to go to New Hampshire, disclose to them that I am in this alternative program, and get written permission from New Hampshire so that I would be able to continue practicing in that state. Several people have asked the question about the relationship of REPLICA to the Emergency Management Assistance Compact. So in a large-scale disaster where the governor declares a disaster and the Emergency Management Assistance Compact is activated, EMAC takes precedent, and no terms or provisions of REPLICA supersede the terms of EMAC with respect to an individual practicing in the remote state in response to such a declaration. EMAC takes priority in this thing, as it really should, because sort of many different kinds of rules in a large-scale disaster get suspended, and states have to provide authority and permission for all kinds of people to do various functions within their state during disasters. So a little more about this national database. The REPLICA model legislation that each state passes provides for the creation of this national database. States can get in and see the complete licensure history of individuals. So if there was a question about Dan Manz from Vermont crossing into New Hampshire could look on the national database, see what my licensure status and history in Vermont was. It provides the ability for states to share real-time significant investigatory information. There's some definition about that in the REPLICA law, and that's going to be part of the rulemaking process as well. States can share the licensed disciplinary history, so it would be possible for a remote state to know that Dan had had conditions on my license from 1989 to 1990, something like that, but that I currently have a clean, unrestricted license. And it would also provide the ability for the cross-border notification of any out-of-state suspension of my privilege to practice. So if New Hampshire, as an example again, were to take an action on my privilege to practice based on my Vermont license, as soon as that was entered into the national database by New Hampshire, an automatic notification would be sent to all other states saying, New Hampshire's taken an action on Dan Manz's privilege to practice. Dan Manz is not authorized to use the REPLICA privilege to practice under under the terms of REPLICA today. Who's paying for all of this? So the good news is, when you think about it, this whole REPLICA thing is actually pretty cheap. It's not a big budget sort of operation. And really the kind of significant expense in this is for the establishment and management of the coordinated database. The National Registry is currently supporting REPLICA. They're also have given some money to the National Association of State EMS Officials for advocacy to try and provide education and get more states signed up. I'm a subcontractor to NREMT. NREMT is getting the money to pay for that from the National Registry of EMT. The registry is interested in this because, as I said earlier, they hold the national certification information. But when you think about it, the National Registry doesn't know much today about where EMTs and paramedics are practicing. They don't know which states they're holding licensure in. They don't know anything about the status of that licensure and whether some infraction that requires a state to remove or condition a person's license, should that have any effect on their national certification. The language in the model compact law provides the authorization for the commission to raise money or have states support the cost of compact operations. A number of states have said, hey, look, we're okay with this thing as long as it doesn't start costing us an arm and a leg. I think that's a pretty unlikely scenario going forward, only because the compact operations are not all that expensive to maintain. So what do we need to do next? Well, the goal right now is to get as many states as possible to pass REPLICA legislation, because the more states we can get in, the better this thing gets for everybody that is already in. And it's also, the more states that get in, I think it subtly begins to put pressure on the other states to say, wait a minute, all these other states can share this privilege to practice for their personnel back and forth. Why aren't we in on that? And from my perspective, there's really little reason for a state not to want to join REPLICA. I think, some states may have to deal with this FBI background check. A couple of states still have to deal with use of the National Registry exam, but for the most part, the bar is not high, and the benefit, it seems to me, is very, very good for states. It's good for providers in that it facilitates their ability to move across borders. It's good for states in that it sort of enhances their ability to know more about who's coming into their state practicing. How can educators help? Well, believe me, you guys, I think, are a key part of the formula and the puzzle in making this thing work. First off, I hope you folks will be advocates within your states as you consider REPLICA legislation. I think as you have individual people coming through your educational programs, help them understand the vision of REPLICA, help them understand the implications of REPLICA for their ability to work in cross-border situations, and take the opportunity to correct misunderstandings about REPLICA. Because I hear people say, oh yeah, if my state passes REPLICA, that's just like I have a license in all these other states. That's not exactly true. It's like you have a privilege to practice in other participating REPLICA states, but it's not really a multi-state license. And so where can you send people for more information? We've got a website, www.emsreplica.org. My email, manz@emsreplica.org. My phone number is down there. Feel free to send any specific questions, or if you're teaching and students start asking you things that you say, wait a minute, I'm not sure that I heard that exactly right, please don't hesitate to reach out at any time. That's my purpose in life. That's why I'm here. That's sort of the end of my formal presentation, and we've got a few minutes, I think, left. I'm happy to take any questions that you may have submitted along the way.
All right, thank you very much, Dan. And if anyone would like to ask a question, you can type it out in the little question box on the bottom right hand of your screen. In the meantime, I'll give my little spiel. We have an update to the webinar schedule. Due to the symposium coming up in about 3 weeks, a little bit over 3 weeks, we will not be having one in September. The next webinar will be held in October, and that'll be officially placed on the NREMT website coming up here in hopefully the next couple of weeks. If anyone would like to reference this webinar at any point, it will be up on the NREMT website under webinars. Let's see if we have any questions. We just have one comment from Robert. He just wants to say thank you, Dan, for the great information.
Oh, no, thank you. I appreciate all of you who are here today. The more folks we can have talking about Replica and understanding it, the easier my job in working with states to get legislation passed becomes. So thank you all.
All right. If anyone has any follow-up questions, like Dan said, feel free to send him an email. It looks like we have one more question here. This is from Bill Doyle. Bill says, hi, Dan. Is there any guideline or rule if participating states do not share information?
Hey, Bill, how are you? Thanks. I'm glad you could join us. So as part of passing the REPLICA legislation, states have to agree to share the information. It's a requirement of the REPLICA law. So that's something that a state agrees to in advance as the REPLICA legislation is being passed in their state. So I don't anticipate that there would be any problem with a state not wanting to share their information.
All right. With that being said, we will conclude this month's webinar, and we hope to see you in October. Everybody enjoy the rest of their week. Thank you very much.
Matt, thank you, and thanks to everybody who was here.
Yep. Thanks, Dan.
All righty, take care.